It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Daniel Cruz tonight, the Reverend Dr. Daniel Cruz, who has been introduced many, many times in Home Moravian Church. And so I was thinking of a different way to introduce him. And I'd like to think of Daniel's life through the prism of words, because words are important in any preacher's life, any pastor's life. There are liturgies to be led, scriptures to be read, sermons to be communicated. Beyond that, Daniel has studied for a PhD in English literature, which certainly has a lot of words. He's been further involved with words by going to the country of our language's origin, where English is, and language itself, are so highly regarded. I think growing up, I thought mostly of language as troublesome rules to follow. Who invented these rules? Who enforces them? Well, they were enforced in the 1950s the way they're not today. But in any case, Daniel entered the realm of England for his second doctorate in church history and theology. And those people over there have some doubts about what's happened to their language as it crossed the Atlantic and took root here. I was a college student in Bethlehem when A.J. Lewis came from England to teach in the theological seminary. And he had quite a wit, but when he was about to leave, he said he thought he'd like to see a plaque put on the house that he rented from the college. English was once spoken here. In addition to using words for the preachers and pastors' skills, Daniel has been involved with writing hymns, with updating hymns, with writing history, with editing history. Well, and updating history too, I'm sure, with translation, and much more. Tonight, we have asked him to focus on his editing work of the Moravian records of the Cherokees and tell us the story of the Trail of Tears, both very important in itself and as also an introduction to next week's program, in which Brother Graham Wrights will talk to us from a diary kept by an American, not a Native American, on the Trail of Tears. So we're going to learn about the Trail of Tears tonight, and a week from tonight we'll be on the Trail of Tears. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, as always, for your kind words of introduction. And all of that about words. I assure you, fear not, I will not use a whole lot of words tonight. So, but, and I'm glad too to sort of give background for a better understanding what Brother Graham will be doing next week. I feel a little bit like on these concert tours, I'm Graham's warm-up band. So, but anyway, I think it might be well to start with just a little bit about the Cherokee in general, which our earliest records, earliest references to them refer to them as a noble nation. And that was pretty high praise back in those days. But the Cherokee did have a strong civilization of their own. I know whites sometimes refer to them as one of the civilized tribes, which is a put down. But really they had their own civilization, which was quite well organized, functioned very well for centuries. They lived, the Cherokee homeland was sort of, well, North Georgia was the center of it, but it extended as well into the mountains of North Carolina, into eastern Tennessee, and even over a little bit into Alabama, and presumably a little corner of South Carolina, but it was quite an extensive realm. And when the Moravians came here to North Carolina, one of our wishes was to carry on missionary work among the Native Americans, and the Cherokee were the main ones. Now, unfortunately, as Moravians, we have a knack for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So we arrived here just in time for the French and Indian War, which didn't really encourage you to go out and start missions. About the time we got through that, we started having the regulator troubles, which ended up in the American Revolution, which again wasn't a very propitious time. And then we had to figure out how to get along in this strange new country that, frankly, the Moravian leaders didn't understand. And they said so. They said, we hear a lot today about American freedom. We don't know what they're talking about. I guess maybe today we still don't, but anyway. But it had been a hope that we could, in time, establish a mission amongst the Cherokee. But it was not until really 1800, nearly 50 years after we got here, that we were able to make a start. The early days, we were sort of at cross purposes because the Cherokee did welcome us, but not particularly as missionaries. They weren't particularly interested in Christianity. They had their own religion, you know. However, they had had enough to do with the Caucasians around them to realize that if they had any hope of being able to, well, function with or perhaps fend off these encroaching people, that they needed to be able to read and write and have some education and be able to function in the white society, even though they wished to remain, well, maybe in, but not of. I think Jesus said something about that, but anyway. And so they wanted us to come to start a school. Well, we wanted to come start a mission. And so it was compromised that, okay, you can have your mission as long as you begin a school for the Cherokee children within a certain time. And that almost led to disaster because we kept putting off and putting off until we did finally start the school. And as years went on, the Moravian missionaries and the Cherokee tended to understand one another better and to respect one another. I say understand one another. We never did learn Cherokee. We always had to have an interpreter. And I thought that was sort of strange because everywhere else we went, we learned the language. And so I said, well, I'll take care of that. And I got myself a Cherokee grammar. And after a few paging through, I said, okay, now I understand. And by the way, I'm the one who taught myself Czech to go to Prague, so, but I mean, for instance, they had 14 separate words for snakeskin, depending on whether it was new or old or on the snake or off, and every other possible permutation. So anyway, but in spite of those troubles, and the Cherokee were fine that we didn't learn Cherokee because they wanted us to teach the children English, so that worked out okay. One missionary in particular, Anna Rosina Gombold, really identified with the Cherokee, and she, with the children. In fact, one of my favorite stories is how she sat up all night in a rocking chair before the fire, rocking one of the Cherokee children who was very sick. And it just seemed such a tender picture. And more surprisingly, the medicine she had brought with her from Salem didn't do a thing for the child. But the child's grandfather came and said, give him this, some of the native medicine, and it will help. Well, surprisingly, at the time, she actually did. Most people would have dismissed it as, heathen, savage nonsense. So she began to have an even greater respect for them. So there was a good bit of give and take, and we never got a huge number of converts, maybe 100 at most. And when you consider that the PEC minutes devote a full 1/3 of their minutes to the Cherokee mission for the whole of the 1800s, you can see we devoted a lot of time to that. We often had 3 missionaries there, plus wives, which when you consider there were only about 5 back in the southern province, that's a pretty good chunk of your clergy that you're sending to this. I said, if the Presbyterians had sent the like number based on their size, they would have had some thousands of missionaries there. So this was very important to us, and it's a shame that a lot of the time Moravians just sort of forgot about that. But anyway, so in 1800, we started the mission. It took a while for anybody to respond to it, though the Peggy, the wife of the James Vann, who was a Cherokee leader who really helped us get started and saw to it that we had what we needed. His wife, or rather his widow, was the first convert. James Vann himself, unfortunately, was a very quarrelsome people, and he liked to drink a bit. Actually, he liked to drink a lot. And one night he was killed in a drunken brawl. And he had never become a member of the church. And I love what the diary entry said. It said, we were sorry for his death, and we said to the Lord, Lord, we know he wasn't a Christian, and we know he did a lot of bad things, but he also did so many wonderful things for us. Do you think maybe you could give him a break? I thought, that's not bad thinking, I think. So anyway, some other people who became prominent in the Cherokee nation also became part of the Moravian church. Charles Hicks, who was, he was later the assistant head chief of the Cherokee, became a Moravian. And then, from their school, by the way, the Moravians do a good job with schools. That may sound redundant, but it is true. And in fact, 5 students who were educated at the Moravian school at Spring Place, which was our headquarters, 5 students from there were sent to the Cornwall Institute in Connecticut for further education, and that was a very prestigious school, so they were able to hold their own. And by the way, on their journey north, they visited former President Jefferson and were well received. They dined with President Madison and were introduced to President Monroe. I've never been introduced to President Monroe. So, you know, it shows the quality of the work we did, though it did not reach huge numbers. But there had been talk about moving these native tribes off their native lands to make room for the white people and sending them somewhere, usually west of the Mississippi. There'd been some talk about that for years, but it had been sort of a low rumble. Something to worry about a little, but not to get too excited about. And in fact, during the 1820s, things really looked to be going well. In 1819, the Cherokee and the United States government signed a treaty, which our records say was a very good thing because it has fixed the borders for that portion of the Cherokee Nation which desires to remain there. It had fixed them forever. Well, obviously, it didn't. There was time and again. Now, I'm sure the phrase white man talk with forked tongue was more from 1950s Westerns than it was anything a Native American ever actually said, but I think it sums up what happened pretty well. But still, that consequences weren't immediate, and they started a new school and a mission house, that is, new buildings for the school there at Spring Place. They opened a second mission as well, and things seem to be increasing well. About this time, 1821, Sequoyah developed his syllabary. It's not an alphabet, but each symbol is for a syllable in Cherokee, which enabled the Cherokee to actually write down their language, which was a tremendous advantage. And they used that, one, to start publishing a newspaper. I mean, our view of Native Americans at this time is, again, colored by 1950s Westerns, and, you know, we see them squatting around the campfire and maybe a teepee, which there wasn't a teepee within 800 miles of the Cherokee, but, you know. In fact, they had separate farms. The James Vann I mentioned actually lived in a plantation house. I mean, think of Tara and Gone with the Wind. Well, it was almost that way. So, you know, they were a very, very stable and in some cases a wealthy community. So things were increasing. By the way, Sequoyah and one of the students of the mission school at Spring Place quickly printed the Moravian litany in Cherokee, of which there are copies in the archives. So, you know, things seem to be going pretty well here. We often got questions, though, well, what did you have to do with Sequoyah? And unfortunately, I could find no reference that we had anything whatsoever to do with Sequoyah. I would love to be able to say the Moravian missionaries inspired him to, you know, form his syllabary. Well, not so. But who knows, somebody may turn up something someday, though if Richard and I didn't go through it, I don't think it's there to be found, but we'll see. Anyway, again in the 1820s, the new Testament had been translated into Cherokee, not by us, I think it was the Presbyterians, but that proved to be a great advantage also. In fact, Major Ridge, one of the Cherokee, who was a chief, arrived in Salem to enroll his daughter Sally in the girls' boarding school. This was in 1826. So already there was some interchange there, and more of the girls came as the situation grew more dire to sort of for their own protection as well as their education. But still, in even the later 1820s, things are looking fairly promising. Again, a little talk about getting rid of the Indians, but nothing that they didn't think they could handle. But then came 1829, and gold was discovered in the Cherokee Nation, the territory. Well, the end had come, though it took them another 10 years to get there. I've been asked, well, what were the causes of the Trail of Tears? And it's one word: greed. Georgia had never been happy with their northern part of their state, sort of technically part of another nation, but once they found out there was gold there, Georgia proceeded to abolish Cherokee government. They refused state citizenship to the Cherokee people. The Cherokee, by the way, sought an injunction from the U.S. Supreme Court to protest that treatment. However, it was ruled that the Cherokee are not a foreign power, but are, quote, domestic dependent nation, and therefore cannot maintain an action in federal court. Well, that didn't look good, but still. And then in 1830, following a campaign promise of President Andrew Jackson, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. Basically it said the Indians east of the Mississippi are going to be shipped west, and you won't have to worry with them anymore. But like most government programs, it took a while to get going. However, in 1831, the Georgia legislature ordered all whites living in Cherokee land to swear obedience to the state laws of Georgia or leave the state. That meant the Moravian missionaries technically had to leave Georgia, because we refused to say we acknowledge Georgia law above United States law or moral law if it comes to it. Actually, we did manage to keep one missionary there because he got a job as the U.S. postmaster for the district. And as a government employee, he was not forced to leave. So he postmastered on the side and preached full time. So, we always obey the law. It may be the letter of, but in this case, that was a very good thing. Now, the Georgia Guard was not really happy with all of this, and there was a prominent Presbyterian missionary named Samuel Worcester. Sounds like he comes from Massachusetts or somewhere. But anyway, he had not left the territory, so the Georgia militia came in and threw him in jail. And he sued, and the case got to the Supreme Court. Now remember, because this is a white man, his case was heard. The Indians had no standing, but this was a white man. And indeed, Chief Justice Marshall said that Georgia's laws are in direct hostility to treaties between the United States and the Cherokee Nation. And President Andrew Johnson's reply was, Chief Justice Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Right. Anyway, in 1833, some Georgia residents turn up at our mission in Spring Place and says, you got to get out. We now own this. We won it in the state lottery. And Georgia was wasting no time. Well, again, though another missionary had taken over as postmaster, this time even that didn't work, and he had to go over into Tennessee and make trips back as he could to minister to the Cherokee. So at this point, things are beginning to get really tense, and some of the Cherokee themselves were not totally united as to what to do. I mean, nobody thought that having their land taken away was a good idea. I mean, just think, if you go on a long weekend and come back and there's some family from Europe living in your house and saying, oh, we own this now, but you can just move down the street and it'll be okay. Well, that's essentially what we were doing. And so some actually went ahead and did migrate across the Mississippi, figuring it was inevitable and, they would just go ahead and get it over with. Within most of the nation, however, some felt that they should resist. But the majority felt like if it comes to open warfare between the Cherokee and the United States Army, we're all going to get slaughtered. And so what was called the Treaty Party tried to negotiate with Washington to postpone whatever might happen as long as possible, to have a new treaty which made at least some guarantee Cherokee did not include their immediate displacement. There was quite a bit of dissension in the Cherokee over this, though it never did come to actual armed conflict. But it was about this time that Principal Chief John Ross brought his daughter Jane to the boarding school here in Salem, figuring she'd be a lot safer here. And as he went back and forth trying to negotiate with Congress, he always stopped here in Salem. Well, partly to see his daughter, of course, but also to let the Moravian officials here know the progress of things. And indeed, towards the very last, when even he could see there was no hope of any reprieve whatsoever, he stopped and told the Provincial Elders Conference here about it on his way back to the Cherokee land, so that actually our PEC learned about it before the Cherokee themselves did, which again is a terrible thing. So anyway, the Treaty Party by 1836 finally saw that, well, we're just going to have to sign the treaty and hope for the best. It's either that or we'll become extinct. And so in 1836, in May, the United States Senate ratified the removal treaty, and President Jackson signed it, and the Cherokee were given 2 years to leave their ancient homeland. 2 years. And for a territory where it said they will be safe from encroaching Americans. Well, a later story shows even that wasn't true, but, it's the best they could do. And so in 1837, several families of Cherokee Moravians set out for the West, but their timing was bad. They set out in December and got caught in the winter and had to winter somewhere up the road until spring. And so we're coming now close to what is the actual Trail of Tears. We sent new missionaries down to Georgia with the idea that they would go with the Moravians, Cherokee Moravians, to their new home and continue to minister there. And so on the 16th of September, 1838, they held the last service at our mission in Spring Place, Georgia. And we can't exactly say that they were on the Trail of Tears, because here again, we're dealing with government bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy had made such a mess of the schedule that nobody knew who was going where when. So we decided that it would be better for our missionaries to go on ahead first and be there to welcome the Cherokee when they arrived. They also felt, and this is significant, that if they actually went on the march, the government-endorsed march, that this might be interpreted that they approved of what was happening, which they definitely did not. So for that reason, we were not technically on the Trail of Tears with them, but certainly suffered. Now, the government proceeded to round up all the Cherokee it could find. A good number of them escaped into the mountains of North Carolina, and the government couldn't find them, and that's why we have the Eastern Band of Cherokee today. So if you go to Cherokee, that's why they're there. They sent groups of soldiers out to force the people out of their homes, to bring them into internment camps, and keep them there until they could be sent across the river. Now, this too was a terrible thing, because while they were there, they were in bad conditions. Sickness was rampant, and our missionaries coming back from Tennessee tried to do what they could for the people in these camps. And in one of them, people were just lying on the ground, deathly ill. And our missionary said to the federal officer there, he said, you know, if you would spread these people out, I don't know that he said 6 feet, but if you'll spread them out, there won't be as much contagion. And the officer responded to him, actually, I think it was a sergeant, said, oh, why bother? It's easier to bury them here than to have to drive them across the Mississippi. Another time, the male missionary had some business away, and his wife was home with the children, and late at night there was a knock on the door, and it was pouring rain, and when she opened it, there was a federal officer, a captain, who said, sorry to bother you, ma'am, but we got a gang of Cherokees here we've rounded up, but it's just such a bad storm, we need shelter for the night. And the missionary's wife said, of course you may have shelter. Bring the Cherokee into our house. You and the soldiers can sleep in the barn. Well, I mean, that's all we could do, you know. We couldn't oppose it as such. So anyway, that's the kind of thing that was going on, which is something we can hardly even imagine for ourselves. But finally, in the autumn of 1838, the actual Trail of Tears began in earnest, and some 14,000 Cherokee, from babes in arms to the elderly, began the march on the Trail of Tears towards what became Oklahoma. They called it Arkansas then, but 14,000. Now, we don't think, it's not like the tribes of Israel exiting Egypt. There were actually several groups they were divided into several companies because they couldn't even feed 14,000 altogether. So there were several groups who left at different times and took different routes towards the west. There was the northern route, the central route, and anybody want to guess the third one, the southern route. And some went mostly by land, others got to the river and were transported on boats. They all eventually had to get on a boat to get across the river, but there were various ways, and some of our Moravian leaders were appointed to head some of the various groups. Some of the Cherokee who had gone earlier out to this land did not really welcome those who were brought in at this point. So there was, again, dissension in the nation. But our missionaries had made it to what is now Oklahoma, and we first set up headquarters at a place called Barren Fork. Now, if you look on an Oklahoma map, you will not find Barren Fork, B-A-R-R-E-N. You will find B-A-R-O-N Fork, which sounds like it had something to do with an English nobleman or something, but actually that's spin. You know, nobody wants to say I'm from Barren Fork. And I have been to Barren Fork, and believe me, it is barren. That's why they let the Cherokee have it. Nobody else wanted it. But we did manage to set up there and stayed there for a few years and then moved to a more friendly place, which they call Canaan. And we established actually several mission stations there. Trying to pick up the pieces from all of the disruption. You know, I said 14,000 Cherokees set out on the Trail of Tears. 4,000 died. That's almost 30% of the nation was wiped out in that. So if you ever wonder why the Trail of Tears is such a terrible emotional issue for the Cherokee, that's why. That's why. Now, it's been a long time since then, and a lot more happened after that, which we can't get into tonight. But just a couple of words about how people felt then and now. Of course, we know how the soldiers felt. But Andrew Jackson is not the Cherokee's favorite U.S. president. They would look upon him sort of like people in the South looked upon Ulysses Grant right after the Civil War. Yeah. Yeah, they called him worse things than that if they could come up with it. But and in fact, you know, if you list their favorite president, Andrew Jackson would come somewhere below, say, Millard Fillmore or James Buchanan, or maybe even, well, you get the idea. Anyway. Interestingly enough, too, remember years ago we had this Cherokee Moravian Historical Society? The dues, the annual dues, were fixed at $20 because it said we want to get as many pictures of Andrew Jackson off the streets as we can. They sort of still have a grudge about that. It's almost like our, speaking of our homeland in Czechoslovakia, I did some postdoctoral studies there and stayed with our Bishop Ulrich. And we were walking down the street one day, and he suddenly stopped and spit on the street and crossed over and walked quickly by. I said, what? And he said, Ignatz. Well, that's Czech for Ignatius. It was the Church of St. Ignatius we were about to pass. And Ignatius Loyola, you may remember, was the founder of the Jesuits, who led the persecution and extermination of the Moravian unity in Bohemia and Moravia. So we're 500 years after that, and Bishop Ulrich still wouldn't walk down the street on the same side as that. I didn't have quite that experience myself, though a few years, actually several years now ago, I was invited to come out to Oklahoma and address the Trail of Tears Society, which is a very prestigious historical research group and everything. And so I went out and told them, okay, what's a Moravian? You know, the Moravian 101, basically. But when I stood up to speak, I wasn't too sure what kind of welcome I would get, but I started off by saying, I must confess to you that on our way out here, we stopped in Jackson, Tennessee overnight. And I heard, brrr. And then I said, but I spit on the sidewalk, and I got a rousing cheer and a standing ovation, and it didn't matter what I said from that point on. Anyway. So the Moravian mission, as I say, lasted until the end of the 1800s, when we gave it over to the Lutherans, who still maintain a school at the Spring Place site. The Cherokee have been very, very interested in the publications of our records because they are practically a daily account of what went on in their nation for 100 years, and nothing else comes close to doing that. We spend too much time talking about church stuff, but we also bring in a lot of Cherokee stuff, so it is tremendously valued for that, and we will hope that can continue. But we are very well welcomed out there, and you know, as well, Graham, Christian Lewis was what kind of uncle of yours? First cousin to your great-great-grandfather. That sounds like a Moravian statement. But anyway, he actually died out there after he took over from his son. Another Bishop Herman from here much earlier, in I think the 1840s, also died on a trip out to visit the Cherokee mission. That's why when Bob Sawyer in the 80s said, I'm going to go out and visit Oklahoma, and I said, Bob, you might want to think about that a little bit. But he went, and all was well. So, anyway, we are glad that a relationship has lasted as long as it did, as cordial as well as it did. We wish we could have done more, not only at the Trail of Tears, but throughout the mission. But we certainly gave it what we could. So that's the Trail of Tears. Yes.
That they were one of the groups that was said we're not allowed to go on the Trail of Tears. But you said
Well,
some did go.
Yeah, well, go ahead. Huh? Oh, she said that she had read somewhere that the Moravians were specifically not allowed to go on the Trail of Tears. And I think there was some kind of directive to that. But, yeah.
The document was from.
Okay. Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing too, but anyway, but as we saw, it didn't really matter because we had other arrangements as well. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
I believe I recall you got some kind of award or special
Well, yeah. It was actually, oh, he said, he had heard I got some kind of reward from the Cherokee not too long ago. Actually, it was the archives of which I was a part received the Worcester Award. And remember, the Worcester was the Presbyterian and very respected. For somebody who is not a Cherokee, who has contributed greatly towards their culture and appreciation. And so we received that. It wasn't just me. Actually, I did get a nice present for Linda's and my wedding. Jack Baker, who was on the Cherokee Tribal Council and sort of a go-between on this project, actually flew all the way from Oklahoma to attend our wedding. And he brought us a present from the council, which was a blanket that had Sequoia syllabary on it, which we have folded over our living room couch. So, yes, we have official and unofficial things, but, yeah, but that was nice. Anybody else?
Well, the one thing, oh, sorry. The other thing, I think was in your annotated timeline. To show how there were some good relations still with the Moravians and Cherokee, that when John Ross died, they invited the Moravians to do the funeral.
Right. Yeah, before the removal, it actually, when they built a new council house at their, they said, she asked or said that she had read there was good relations between Moravians and Cherokee all along, and that when Chief John Ross died, a Moravian minister was asked to conduct his funeral, which is quite true. And before that, before the removal, the Cherokee had built a new council house in their capital of New Echota, and the Moravian missionary was invited to come and participate in the dedication of that. So we were very much involved in the sort of central things of the Cherokee, the life of the Cherokee. Yes, ma'am.
I know that originally Moravians would not swear oaths.
Yes.
Is that another reason that they would not swear an oath to the state of Georgia when they were asked to do so, or by that time had that fallen?
By that time, that had sort of fallen away. If you'd speak clearly enough, I wouldn't have to do this. She was asking if the fact that we wouldn't swear the oath had anything to do with our aversion to swearing oaths in the earlier days. I think by then that had more or less passed away. And though I once refused to swear an oath and solemnly affirmed and put the court into some discussion, but anyway. But I only did that for meanness, not for principle. So, all right. Anybody else? Okay. Thank you.
You're on my list. Okay.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
I'm so glad to meet you. Part of it is out back. I'll get you.
Glad that you're back in the city.
Well, and I've got to look.
We missed having you.
Some recognition. Well, I'll try to do this with the chair.
Appreciate it.